Welcome to the Anxious Child Podcast, the podcast that helps you best work with anxious kids and teens. Now, here's your host, Stephen Quinlan.
Hey everybody, today on the show we have the second episode in our Parents Corner series. I'm really happy to welcome Jim. Jim is the parent of a 14-year-old with high-functioning autism and ADHD. Today we talk about his journey as a parent and what that has been like, and also what it means to be neurodivergent in particular. For those of you who aren't familiar with this term, as we do use it quite a bit throughout the episode, it's a fairly broad term that's used to describe someone who is different in mental or neurological function than what is considered typical. You may or may not be familiar with the idea of being neurotypical or atypical. Both neurotypical and neurodivergent are terms that are often associated with being on the autism spectrum. If you haven't seen the show on Netflix, Atypical, which details a teenager with autism, it's a great example of this. We also cover how Jim and his family have been managing expectations of screen time, particularly in the pandemic, and media consumption, and we take a look at social skills in particular and how many of us may be navigating the social world without really being fully aware of many of the complexities which are happening on an unconscious level, and how baffling and difficult these can be for people on the autism spectrum. We also cover the crossover into anxiety and where a lot of this comes from for Jim's son. The latest research around autism says that 80% of kids with the diagnosed autism spectrum disorder also have qualities of an anxiety disorder as well. It's a great conversation with a lot of humor in it, and I really thank Jim for being so open and all of the takeaways that he leaves us with. Before we jump into the episode, a quick word from our sponsors. I think we can all agree that we don't need any extra anxiety in our life. We know something that causes anxiety is clutter, especially cord clutter. Mount Genie at mountgenie.com makes clever tech accessories and mounting solutions for your Alexa, Google Home, video game consoles, and all brands of Wi-Fi mesh router networks that rein in that messy cord clutter in your home or office. Mount Genie also has organizational solutions for your keys, remotes, sunglasses, and more. Most install without tools in minutes and won't cause damage to walls. Mount Genie is a family-owned company solving your cord clutter problems. Check them out today at mountgenie.com. And don't forget, while you're there, to enter in the code ANXIETY10 to get 10% off. I've got several of their products in my house, and they really look great. They're super easy to install. So check them out today at mountgenie.com, and don't forget the code ANXIETY10 at checkout. If you want to be healthier, one of the best things you can possibly do is get at least 7 hours of quality sleep every night. I know it's hard to get that much sleep sometimes. Your mind keeps you awake, you can't get comfortable. There are 100 reasons why you can't get 7 hours quality sleep. But it's super important because your body heals itself when you're asleep. Do you want to know an easy way to get more quality sleep every night? Make sure you're getting enough magnesium. Believe it or not, around 75% of people don't have enough of it. But please don't run to the store to buy the first magnesium supplement you find. Most magnesium supplements use only the 2 cheapest synthetic forms. And since they're not full spectrum, they won't fix your magnesium deficiency. There are actually 7 unique forms of magnesium, and you must get all of them if you want to experience its calming, sleep-enhancing benefits. That's why I recommend Magnesium Breakthrough by BioOptimizers. Simply take 2 capsules before you go to bed, and you'll be amazed at how much better you sleep and how much more rested you feel when you wake up. For an exclusive offer from my listeners, go to that's MAG, breakthrough.com/anxiety and use the code ANXIETY10 during checkout to save 10%. Okay, one other quick note before we get going. You'll notice that Jim refers to his son as B. This is done in an effort to protect his anonymity. I'm really enjoying all of the concrete and pragmatic advice and life experiences that are coming out of these Parents Corner episodes, and I'm hoping you will too. So here we go. Here is me and Jim talking about his 14-year-old son, B. Thanks so much for being here. I appreciate your willingness to do this, share your story, etc. Hopeful that it's going to be helpful to a lot of people. But I before we get into that too much, I wanted to just get a sense of kind of your general background and what you like to do for fun. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm a nerd, so a lot of nerd things come up in my life: role-playing games, board games, reading. I do a lot of novel reading and stuff like that. I am eagerly anticipating the next thing that Marvel has to offer on TV or movies or whatever. I just like consuming that kind of stuff, and that does carry over into the family a lot. I married a nerd, so she's of similar interests. B, our son, has picked up on that as well, as has our oldest. He's in the other room playing video games right now. So we're a media consumer kind of family, but my background is in journalism and writing. So I do it with an eye toward, being honest about what it is that we're taking it in. And it's like, people are like, oh, that stuff is just escapism. I'm like, yes, have you met the world? It's really nice to escape from it sometimes. And this is my preferred method of doing it. You fix cars, I read comic books. So that's sort of where we are with that. My youngest B, who we'd be talking about, he's definitely a child of his era, 14 years old, fairly heavily online, understands memes and things like that on a level that I simply don't get. I now definitely feel like a dad, where I have at least one kid where it's like, I have trouble having conversations with you sometimes because we're talking two different languages. And it doesn't relate to some of the issues that he has in terms of he's on the autism spectrum, has ADHD. It doesn't relate to either of those things. It's just your experience and exposure to language and how it gets used is so different from mine. We have a different vocabulary for how we talk about things, which presents its challenges, but also opportunities. I try and keep open to it. Like, he's not bad because he talks differently than me or because he thinks differently. It's not like this is gross or wrong. It's just he's different. He's of a different generation, literally. He's 30 years younger than me. If he were like me, that'd be creepy and weird.
Yeah, well, I love the awareness that you're describing around that there is a generational difference. And it's certainly a harbinger of being a dad is that differences in communication styles, awareness of various things that are going on in the world. I feel like a lot of kids even sort of gravitate towards things that they purposely know that their parents won't understand, because that's way it's like, I can be into this thing and it's my thing and it's got nothing to do with you.
Absolutely. It's something that's independent, and I try as much as I can. It's a little difficult, more difficult with him than it is with my oldest, to try and find those places where he wants that independence and where this is like, no, Dad, I don't want you to understand this.
Right.
Like, don't try and look for understanding on this. I need a thing. It's like, okay, you can have that. That's fine. Right. He does this thing where he draws a picture and then other people do stuff with the picture and share it around and stuff. I don't get why it's a big deal, but he really likes doing it. And I guess it's a thing the kids are doing these days. I'm just like, go have fun. And you're enjoying it. Again, it's that escapism element of, it's participatory. I kind of look at it and I tried to explain to him the exquisite corpse idea, which I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Can you explain that a little bit?
The exquisite corpse was actually a game I think they played in France in the 19th century, where you would have a bunch of people who would you'd have a sheet of paper and you'd draw the head, and then you'd fold over the top of the sheet of paper and hand it to someone, and they'd draw the upper part of the body, and then they'd fold that over, and the next person would draw the lower part of the body and then the legs. And the idea was to be as crazy and out there as you could be. And then you'd unroll the piece of paper and you'd have this body that's just
wacky.
Parts didn't match up and really weird. And that kind of idea, I think, is sort of eternal, of just kind of like mashing up creative ideas together. And it seems to be sort of the same thing, which I think is interesting, because I'm just like, I don't really understand this particular application of it and why this is interesting, but it's interesting to see that it's an eternal desire to fiddle.
Yeah, and there's some things that ideas, fashions, trends, they're circular in that way, and they come back in sort of a new flavor. But I also love, and we were talking about awareness, that there is that meta awareness that you are describing when you're talking about escapism and the various forms of media consumption. And certainly that looks a lot different in today's generation. It's something I hear a lot about in terms of struggles and how to manage that, particularly these days when everything is pretty much on a screen. And I want to get into the autism, the ADHD that you described, and possible tie-overs into anxiety. But while we're at this place, how have you guys managed that? The screens, the escapism, the video games. What has that been like for you?
To be frank, during COVID, not a whole lot. I mean, it was a deeply stressful time for a lot of people, and we wanted as much as possible to be like, okay, you need to do the things that are going to keep you sane and that are going to keep you whole and that are going to keep you engaged in the world, whatever those are. And we just kind of let them determine the shape of them and watch behaviors and watched attitudes around things to be like, I think you're probably going a little too far in this direction. I think we need to cut down on this. One of the big components, I think, in terms of screen time and media is there appears to me to be a lot of parents who don't participate in it with their kids. Like, you don't—
it's a babysitter.
They use it to kind of like, this is going to distract you. And B usually uses media for social media to interact with people, to interact with peers, which was really helpful during the pandemic because, of course, he couldn't go to school. He couldn't even leave the house. And while he had some discomfort around normal social interactions, that was what he was used to. So having even that uncomfortable social interaction taken away from him, it's sort of like, if you can't watch any movies at all, even B movies start to feel really, really good. So social media kind of took over some of that for him, and he got to know some people online, and it's overall been really positive for him in terms of he's been exposed to social situations that he might not otherwise have been. People tend to have a different representation of themselves online than they do in person. There's an anonymity to it, so he's gotten to know a bit more about people because they feel more comfortable hiding behind a username. And we've worked with him to like coach him on these are the kind of behaviors you need to watch for someone who's interacting with you online. If they ever ask you where you live, if they ever ask you how old you are or what your gender is or what your sex is, any of these questions, if they start asking probing personal questions, back away from that. If you, these are the types of formats of social media that are safer than others. In a direct message with someone, you need to be much cagier than when you're in a larger room with them, where you're just kind of chatting. It's like, there's a big kind of trying to think it through with social situations. And that, I think, actually is true for most people. Don't know how to interact online and social media. So where he's the first generation who really has to interact with it and has to interact with it, it's just there. It's not going away. He's probably going to have his first interview for a major job virtually. That's just the nature of the world and the nature of employment at this point. We want to make sure that he's as educated as he can be on it, but at the same time, let him use it for the fun and escapism that it is. So when it comes to his media use, we monitor that fairly carefully. We've got a couple little programs on the computer where I can go in and see what sites he's on. There are times when he's tried to use incognito windows to go around them, which oddly enough hasn't been for anything that I would even find slightly problematic. I think, again, back to your point of I want
This
to
is
rebel
mine.
and I want to have my own
Mhm.
thing. I think that was where most of that was coming from. But he's basically what most people would call a good kid. So it's just give him the education and the tools that he needs in order to engage with stuff in a meaningful way, and he'll use those tools to his benefit. Most of his anxiety issues really revolve more around in-person interactions, because there's, of course, huge components of things that you can't predict and can't prepare for adequately when you're in an interpersonal reaction that just don't come up online.
Yeah. It really is, as you mentioned, this is the first generation going forward where it's going to be a big part of their lives, and it's going to be something that they have to learn how to navigate in an appropriate fashion. More so than, as adults, it's kind of, I feel like there's this option of you can kind of take it or leave it somewhat. I mean, I suppose that's sort of true somewhat for the kids, but not as much, because so much of interaction, be it, actual online interaction or fostering in real life interaction, might even originate with that.
Mhm.
So they have to have those skills. There's of course that other question of, you mentioned being able to hide behind the username, and how that gives you that comfort and ability to interact in ways that you might not otherwise feel comfortable doing, which is wonderful because it's practice and it's helping you feel confident in doing those things. But the real life interaction, as you said, is this whole other animal. So it's a bit of a balancing act there, I feel like, which,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah.
And the one thing that comes up is, people talk about how, oh, it's so much more dangerous interacting online. And
Mhm.
it's like, I don't think that you were a woman growing up in the 60s or 70s, or you don't remember being, if you think that's the case. Like, the world has always been a dangerous place for social interaction. Like, there's never been a time when it's really comfortable. This is just a new place where people can be uncomfortable, or where things can go badly. And we just need to navigate and figure out, okay, we have a new form of social interaction. It's going to be bad and it's going to be good, because we're humans, and that's the nature of our social interactions. Is
Uh-huh.
there's good parts to it and there's bad parts to it. So
Uh-huh.
how are we going to make sure that it's as good as it can be, and that our kids are as safe as they can be when they learn how to navigate it?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Well, take us back a little bit to in the early stages of your son's life and going through. You mentioned the autism spectrum diagnosis, the ADHD. How did that kind of come about? When did you first start to notice things?
To be honest, I identify as neurodivergent myself. I'm
Uh huh.
not actually diagnosed. So I have some of the same things that he has, and difficulty noticing people's issues with social interaction. So I didn't notice a whole lot of it. I
Mm-hmm.
thought he was just kind of a slightly odd kid.
Mm-hmm.
He had some quirks when he was in kindergarten. It was just him and one other student. We're in a very small town, who were in kindergarten together. And he and the other student would play games together. And he never got upset when he lost. Like, it just wasn't in him to be upset when he got lost. Like, he would lose a game 3 times in a row, and each time he'd be like, "Good job, man. Good job, man. Nice job." And the teacher praised him for it. And I thought, that's actually a little strange. Like, most kids aren't like that. And he's competitive in other ways. And I'd question him about, why didn't you want to win the game? And he wouldn't be able to articulate back a reason why he was like that. He didn't seem to have an internal emotional life that he could express externally. Which, even for young kids, they can usually like kind of fumble through, or come up with some kind of phrasing, or they have the desire or the want to try and express their internal dialogue externally. And he just didn't have that, which that was the first thing that triggered in me. I'm like, an unusual characteristic for a kid to have. He was a little bit of a late speaker, so I thought it might be related to that. By grade 2, it became obvious that he was rather different from his peers, or many of his peers, in a lot of ways. He needed to get up and move around more than many of them during class. He had difficulty concentrating in class. He was showing that he was having trouble picking up social cues and social interactions. When under stress, he would act out, not violently, but he would just become emotionally upset. And it seemed to come out of nowhere. It would just be, he'd be going along really level, really kind of flat, actually, like seemingly disinterested. And then just all of a sudden, boom, these emotions would well up seemingly out of nowhere. That was when we took him to a local psychology institute and had him go through testing, and they diagnosed him as being on the autism spectrum and having ADHD.
Okay, and he was how old at that point?
Grade 2. Terrible name.
So
it would have been about 8 or 9.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
7 or 8.
Okay.
Yeah, there was one of my favorite stories to tell that kind of encapsulates his personality. His teacher in grade 2 did not respond well to him. Like she saw him as being kind of an uppity kid who wasn't paying attention in class. Like he was a rabble rouser. He was a troublemaker because he needed to get up and move. And she didn't appreciate that in her class. It is disruptive to a class to have a kid getting up. So he got up from his desk and he went to the back and he picked up a book and he was just riffling through it. Like he was just flipping through the pages, kind of making noise. And she says to the back of the class where he is, "Mr. Would you like to teach today's lesson on polar bears?" Standard confrontational tactic that a teacher might use to be like, "Do you want to do this job? No, you don't. Now get back in your seat."
I think I know where this is going.
He went up and he talked about polar bears because we watched a lot of Steve Irwin. And he was actually paying attention to the lesson. He was taking in the information. He just wasn't responding to the teacher in the way that the other kids were. The other kids are, maintaining eye contact. They have their hands on their desk or they're drawing on a piece of paper or something like that. And Brandon didn't have the social cues necessary to understand what he was expected to do. And that's becomes sort of the focus with him, is expected versus unexpected behaviors. And letting at home, what we let him know is, if you demonstrate unexpected behaviors, there's going to be consequences for them because it's the way the world works. And it's not even necessarily fair or right that it should be that way. He was learning in that classroom as much as any of those other kids were, but he wasn't doing it in a way that the teacher expected. So there was a consequence of him getting called out for it, and that's going to continue to happen. It's not necessarily fair, but it's true. And that actually kind of forms the basis for a lot of his anxiety, because he's just sort of like, he has no idea what neurotypical people are going to be asking of him next in a lot of situations. And it's just sort of like, sometimes it seems completely arbitrary. And he has some difficulties navigating with, not just, he isn't even necessarily aware that a situation has expectations on him, let alone what those expectations are.
What was his reaction when he found that out, that there are these expectations that are out there in the world and they might be somewhat divergent from what it is that you see as being normal kind of behavior yourself? Was he upset with that?
He was, yeah. He kind of sees it as being unjust. He's talked about that before. It's not fair that I should have to do these things, or that I should be expected to behave in these ways just in order to, make friends or interact in a classroom or something like that. It definitely is something that he considers to be not right. It's off balance. He I forget what grade it was. It was grade 4. He was in part of a social skills group at school, and there was a kid who was really disruptive social skills group, and the instructor was kind of working with him and this other kid to try and get them to communicate with each other, even though this kid had a lot of really disruptive behaviors. And I asked him how things went this particular social skills group session, and he said, I would give that an F. So, kind of evaluating it from the perspective of a teacher. He was just like, that was a failing grade. I didn't learn anything from it, and it just frustrated all of us.
In a way, I feel like he's not wrong either,
He's not. And I did try and work with him to be like, there are going to be times when you need to learn how to fail with dignity. Like
Uh-huh.
when an interaction is going to go poorly, and
Uh-huh.
it's never going to go well. Like there's no saving it. There's no turning it into a positive interaction.
Mm-hmm.
Like you just can't. It's gone. But you have to learn how to fail that interaction with dignity and come out of it, come out the other side, at least having survived and as unstressed by it as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like my wife works in retail and I work in
Uh-huh.
customer service. So we're both very familiar with people putting pressure on you that's totally unreasonable. You're never going to satisfy the person. They're
Mm-hmm.
never going to be like, thank you for doing this. You've done exactly what we wanted to. That's great. So you just have to learn how to survive that experience, come out the other side of it with your sanity and your sense of human decency intact.
Yeah, I mean, you can see both sides because on the one hand, so the other kids that are in the classroom, it's potentially distracting to them to have somebody sort of going through the book at the back of the room. And how come he gets to sort of do this behavior and we all have to sit here in their seats? But for him, I feel like he should be able to be the way that he is and not necessarily have to conform to what these societal standards are, because he's certainly doing, on one hand, academically what he needs to do. He learned enough about the polar bears to teach everybody about it. And this often, as I'm sure you're aware, is often the case with kids who are on the autism spectrum, is they're very well educated and in tune with particular subjects, much more so than sort of the general population. So if you ask them about something specifically, they're going to knock your socks off with all their knowledge about it.
What comes up a lot in conversation about autism is they say, kids know all this stuff. And I think it gets treated as savantism
Yeah, right.
when what it usually is, and I don't know how much you've interacted with people on the autism spectrum. If someone on the autism spectrum is stressed out, one of the ways you can tell that they're stressed is they start telling you facts.
Mm-hmm. It's a
They start
self-soothing.
talking to
Yeah.
you. Yeah, it's soothing to them. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like that for them is the accumulation of knowledge is the exact same thing as somebody else saying, I'm stressed out, so I'm going to go make a set of shells and like work out my stress that way. This is like, I'm an autistic child I'm stressed out, so I'm going to go look in Bulbapedia and find out everything about Pokemon. It's the exact same kind of regulation. It's just a different tool that they're using for.
Yeah, really well put. It's something that is predictable and is reliable and is black and white and is
Mm-hmm.
not as nebulous as something like social interaction, where there are all these things happening that are not necessarily clear and they're subtle, and you have to make your best guess or judgment as to what they are, and that can feel unsettling, I think.
Yeah, the social interaction piece of it, sarcasm is coming
Uh-huh.
up now. He's turned
Yeah.
14, so all the teenagers are sarcastic now. And finding out when the sarcasm is aimed at him. Well,
Uh-huh.
first of all, is there sarcasm? Is the sarcasm aimed at him? Is it aimed at the situation? Or is it a collaborative sarcasm where it's like, I'm inviting you into sarcasm. Let's all snark on the teacher or snark on our situation.
Uh-huh.
And trying to balance out that, it's like, it is so much easier to figure out how to use Redstone in Minecraft because that's always going to work that way until the next update.
Right.
But, trying to figure out what is this person who's honestly socially interacting with me? Are they being slightly sarcastic or are they actually being mean? And how do you determine the difference?
Yeah, it's so complicated, really, when you break it down like that. There's so much going on. And I get the sense that you, as his dad and presumably his mom as well, have done your best to try and do that for him in a way that he can try to best, as you were saying, best navigate all that. I'm curious, after he got the diagnosis in second grade, what kind of services did he get, and what sort of outside help had he tried?
I mentioned social skills classes
The social skills class. Yep.
through,
Mm-hmm.
through school. The school he's been a part of, his middle school, has been fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
The principal and the vice principal both have a lot of experience working with kids with special needs, kids on the spectrum, kids with far more profound developmental disorders than what B's had to deal with. So they've just been uniformly supportive. It's been, not a matter of can we accommodate this, it's a matter of how do we accommodate it consistently. So that's, in terms of the schooling, they've been very good at trying to incorporate as much into his daily schedule and as much into his life to help him not only be able to do well in middle school, but prepare him for additional grades. So they've been just incredibly helpful. Also, there's a social worker that he meets with periodically.
Okay.
Hasn't been all that often. They have been having issues with staffing and things like that. But
so that's at the school, the social worker?
No, the social worker is actually through a local program.
Okay.
A local psychology institute. He meets with her periodically. Again, part of it is I hate the word because it makes it sound like there's a problem with the person if they aren't this. He's very high functioning.
Uh-huh.
So like he doesn't have temper outbreaks. He is verbal. He has he's quite capable. If you were to see him on the street or talk with him in a store or something like that, you might come away with that conversation thinking that he's just a fairly quiet kid, and that's it. So he doesn't get as much focus from them as some of their other clients. He used to meet with them very regularly, once a week. He would go out with her and sometimes a group of kids, and they would just work on social interactions. That's really the thing. Like social interactions and emotional regulation is basically all he really needs. Intellectually, most of that gets dealt with through school. The ADHD means that he has issues with planning and issues with following through on assignments and things like that. So they've managed that at the school level.
Okay. Does he have an IEP at school? Is that part of how he's getting
504.
504. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad to hear that you've had that positive experience with your school district. It really does vary. Some are wonderful and they're willing to provide you with all of those services, and that you didn't even have to go the IEP route, that they just kind of were willing to do it through the 504. That's great. What do you feel like in the treatment that he's got and the help that he's received has been most effective for him? Like what's helped him the most? And that can be from you guys or outside, but
the thing he responds to most is practicality.
Okay.
Don't tell him just here's what you need to do. Tell him why, and tell him the function of the skill that you're learning. Like, why do I need to learn how to do this? Well, you need to learn how to do it because of this reason. And being honest with him about it, like at home and with his social worker particularly. At school, they tend to try and put a rosier picture on things, but they're like, oh, this will help you make friends. And it's like, well, no, it might not, but it will help you survive in the world. And we're just very honest with him. It's like, yeah, it really stinks to have to try and figure out whether someone's joking or actually making fun of you. It's not fun. There's nothing fun about the process. Trust me, we know. All experienced it. Even people who were completely neurotypical, have those moments where they're like, I think this person's making fun of me, but I can't quite tell.
Sure, yeah.
But it's still an important skill to get. And it's just like, buckle down, work on it so that you can do this. And it's for your own sense of self-preservation, so that okay, this person is treating me decently and kindly. Oh, this person is acting like they're treating me decently and kindly. It's an act of self-preservation to do that. And just being honest about the fact that that's why we're teaching you these skills, is so that you can be a more whole person.
What's his sense of being different or being neuroatypical? And do you have any idea of how he feels about that?
Isolated a lot of the time. Like in social situations, he's never quite sure how to get in. Like if there's a group of people and everybody's doing various different things or having different conversations, he has difficulty like kind of engaging with that. Even if it's activities or conversations he knows, he's never quite sure whether or not he's talking too much or not enough. If he's ever really part of a conversation, if people are performing an activity, there's kind of a joke in the the neurodivergent community, that when a neurotypical person comes into a room and says, "Hey, what are you doing?" they don't actually want to know what you're doing. They want to do it with you.
Uh-huh.
So being able to navigate that kind of, like, because social interaction is sort of insincere. Hello.
Oh, there's the cat. Hi, kitty.
Yeah. Welcome to Zoom. There is an element of social interaction that is always insincere, where it's like you're kind of, there's a little bit of a dance to it, where you're not quite touching each other yet. And then you get close enough and you're like, okay, now we're holding hands. Now we're really dancing. Now we're socially engaged. And that part of things is really tricky for him. He doesn't, because he struggles with the first couple steps, he never quite gets engaged, or never feels like he never gets quite get engaged, because I've seen him in these social situations, and sometimes he can, like anyone else, I see you two like this thing, go up to them, start talking about it, and have a very good social interaction. But he always walks away from those not quite sure if he got it right. Because he doesn't quite have the mental vocabulary to understand that social language. So it's always just like, I think I did that well, but I'm not sure. He feels like he doesn't have friends, even though he goes over to other people's houses and just hangs out sometimes, and has had kids ask, can B come over and talk or hang out. So, he has people that he hangs out with, but he still feels like, I don't have friends, because he can't exactly define what a friend is. That's kind of the real stress for him there.
Yeah, it must be so difficult. I'm just imagining what that would be like to never really be sure if, and as you were saying, there's some component of that even in quote unquote neurotypical interactions. I think that person liked me. Did they really like me? I'm not entirely sure, but there are times where you are pretty sure, I mean, you're 95% sure. Okay, that seemed like that went well, or yes, I can call this person my friend now. And to not have that must feel so isolating.
And also, we like kind of, there's more of a sense of scale for a lot of people, like what the expectation of a social interaction is set when you meet someone. Like, you go to a faculty function at a college you don't go to, like you don't attend, and you don't teach at, and you're just looking for someone to have some small talk with. Just, I will have an interaction with this person for 10 minutes until the next lecture starts, and that's it. And you'll never talk to them again. You'll never meet them again. You might see their name on a paper sometime later, but that's it. That's all that you have as far as your expectation. That versus, I'm looking for a spouse at this social engagement. That's a much higher level of social commitment. You're looking for a very different kind of social interaction. So, in lacking all of the tools necessary to perceive when you need to have one interaction versus the other, or what do you bring into a conversation that's different in this situation because of the nature of the social interaction. If you start talking to that colleague at the faculty party, like you're grilling them about being a future spouse, that's going to be an awkward interaction. So that's part of it too, is like the kind of the lack of the ability to go from 1 through 10. You're either at 1 or 10 when you're interacting with people.
Sort of grading where it is on that scale and evaluating how heavily am I in this social interaction or not. You mentioned that a lot of his anxiety comes from that realm, the social realm, and I would imagine in some ways might mirror just sort of general social anxiety. Do you see it in any other areas in his life, or is it primarily constrained to that social arena?
It's mostly the social arena. His overall emotional regulation, like if he gets frustrated at a task or something like that, like he's trying to take 2 pieces of Lego apart or something like that, he can regulate that quite well. Like he'll get frustrated, but he knows, I'm frustrated at this, I'm going to throw it down on the ground, I'm going to walk away, and I'm going to do something else for a minute. Just, perfectly normal, sensible way of handling that kind of negative emotion, that kind of negative interaction with people who are close friends and family, and whose rhythms he's more accustomed to dealing with. He doesn't have any issues with those regulations. So it really does come to sort of casual friendships and social interactions with peers that are the primary source of stress. Academically, he has no real issues. He's very smart. On top of having, as we discussed, sort of the typical autism spectrum, taking in knowledge as a form of emotional regulation, and thus having a lot of knowledge, he also knows how to use it and how to bring it out. He's 2 grades ahead in math. So academically, he has no concerns. It doesn't stress him out. He actually prefers to be challenged. A lot of his issues in school have come from when it's like, oh, well, he's on the autism spectrum and he has ADHD. We'll slow things down for him. It's like, no, it's a bad plan. Speed things up, challenge him a lot, and he'll respond more positively. So those don't really have much of an impact on him. A lot of it is just I think this person likes me, but I'm not sure. We had an incident yesterday where he just took things too far in a social situation. And it was absolutely obvious that the whole thing was, he thought this was fun. No one around him thought it was fun. And they were trying to communicate to him that it wasn't fun, but in a very neurotypical kind of passive aggressive, are you sure that's a good idea kind of way. When someone just kind of coming right out and saying, stop now, would have cut to the core of it.
Well, there's that very decisive language that we were talking, that's so clear and cuts to the chase in social interactions so that there is no misunderstanding. Is that something that you would like people to know about if they were, say you were going to tell somebody, here's my son, here's how I would suggest that you interact with him, what works best? Is that something that you would include there?
We're forceful about it. Like we're not as nice as you suggest when you say that. Like,
okay.
He's taken up playing softball.
Okay.
And actually on our church team, and we told one of the coaches absolutely directly, like they suggested to him that he do something, and I just said to him bluntly, I said, if you don't tell him directly what he needs to do and how he needs to do it, he will not do it. Like, you can't suggest something to him, because if he has an idea for how he ought to do it and it's wrong, he's just going to keep doing it that way and be like, I will take your suggestion under advisement and not follow up on it. Like, because that's just how he works. It's like, you're going to fail if you keep trying it this way. Like, there's no point in it. And again, coming around to talking about neurotypicals, they seem to feel a lot of the times as though his reasons for not complying with the way that they think and the way that they do things are because he's belligerent or he's unwilling,
oppositional.
He's being oppositional towards them, and not that he frankly just doesn't get it. Because he comes across, he's very articulate, he speaks very well, he's got a staggering vocabulary, and he's funny. Like, he can tell jokes and things like that, which that's a pretty high level social skill.
Yeah.
So when people interact with him, they expect that he has all of the social tools in his belt that they do. And if he's not demonstrating them, it's because he's a bad person or he's oppositional. It's like, no, you have to understand, you are never going to teach him to be neurotypical. That's not a teachable skill. Like, you can teach him to try and understand how neurotypical people work, and what am I going to do about that?
It comes back to that, I think we were talking about earlier, conforming to this idea of what people would expect from your behavior. That it's, and ultimately you're just putting the round peg in the square hole there. Because it's not going to sort of suddenly be completely different neurologically than he already is.
The world is going to conform to him to the degree that it can, and he will interact with the world in the best way that he can, on the balance. But I'm not willing to have him lose who he is in order to get along with a bunch of people who aren't willing to take him where he is. Like,
what message would you have for parents who maybe are either at the beginning of their journey with autism or anxiety, or just their neurologically atypical kid, what would you want to say to them based on what you guys have learned and what you've been through?
I'm going to be slightly cheesy and say I would first listen.
Okay.
If you've met one autistic kid, you've met one autistic kid.
Yep.
That's it. Like, I can't tell you what your kid's like.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have to figure that out. Don't treat them like a puzzle piece. Treat them as a whole human person, because they are. However functioning they are, however much people say they're low or high functioning, whatever regulation problems they have, we live in a world where there are people who think that the solution to their emotional problems is to grab a gun, go into a church, and open fire. Your kid isn't that. Your kid is whole. Your kid is more whole than that mass shooter. Wherever they are, I think we can agree that they are more emotionally whole than that person. There's a reason why we tend to call such people monsters. Your kid's more whole than that, and appreciate them for that and for what they are. And it's hard. I mean, I don't have any specifics for people other than just recognize that your kid is who they are and figure out how best to fit that kid into the world in a way that's going to let them be who they are. Mm-hmm. Don't try and change them, because you can't.
Uh-huh. But you can know them as best you can. And then based on having that knowledge of who they are, try to help advocate for them to mm-hmm. best fit into the world as they can.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's the same thing that you would do with a neurotypical child. Like I've been blessed to have a neurodivergent and a neurotypical kid. Mm-hmm. And the neurotypical kid has had his fair share of bad social interactions. He is 18. There's been more than a couple of them.
What a surprise.
Yeah. It turns out people are kind of terrible somehow. And, there's bad social interactions that happen. Yeah. So I think part of the struggle too is a lot of times your kid is going to be perfectly fine and they're going to be doing perfectly well. Mm-hmm. If they want to spend a couple hours a day playing Minecraft online with friends and interacting through a chat message box, accept that for the glorious thing it is. Because guess what? Your neurotypical kid probably wants to spend a couple of hours online playing Minecraft, chatting through a text box. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that your neurodiverse kid is broken because he wants to do the same thing as his friends do. Mm-hmm. Just because it's more of an emotional regulation for him and a distraction for the other kid doesn't make it a bad thing.
Well, I really appreciate all of these things that you are imparting to other people. I'm hopeful it's going to be really helpful for others to hear about how to best connect with your kid, and then from that be able to best help them, because as you've so nicely said, that every kid is different, and it doesn't matter if you are neurotypical, atypical, what have you. You need your parents to understand you and be able to help you navigate the world, because we understand the world. We have the experience that we have as adults, and they don't have that going into it. So they need somebody to help them best navigate that.
I will say one of the most amazing things about having him in my life is how much I've learned about the world through him. Mm. Because there are parts of it that I just took for granted, like some of the ways that we interact socially. It's just instinct. You don't think about it. And when you stop and you think about it and you have to ponder through it, and you're like, yeah, that really is terrible. We could do better than that. Or that really is interesting how we do that. I think I could do better than that for other people. I could work on how I do this social interaction myself.
Yeah, it's fascinating. When I was thinking that earlier, when we were sort of breaking down what social interaction looks like, that it is just this sort of almost unconscious process that most of us go through. But when you really look at it, it's insanely complicated. And I'll appeal to your nerddom here and ask you if you know of, there's this book that's called, oh gosh, I think I'm going to blank on the name now. But anyway, the basic idea is that autism and sort of, high functioning or Asperger's is actually an evolutionary trait that human beings are evolving into some other version of human beings that is actually more high functioning but it's just in different areas, so that it's like more knowledge, fact, science based, and not as focused on things like social interactions. I just thought it was an interesting concept that is like, again, as society, we frame that as something that's potentially negative because it doesn't fit into that box, but it doesn't have to be looked at that way.
I actually approach it from the opposite end,
Okay.
which is that we evolved out of autism and out of neurodivergence. Because if you look at historically some of the people who have performed the best in history, it's a lot of the behaviors that we consider to be neurotypical have not been productive for humanity for a particularly long length of time. So I think we've actually developed into a more socially integrated and more close society that works against our tendency towards neurodiversity, which is kind of an odd way of putting it. We refer to the neurodiverse as the minority, but they really aren't. It's just that being neurotypical is so ingrained and so typical of our society that it's the default. Neurodiversity is, in a lot of cultures, it's praised and it's valued. And it has been for years. The shaman, the witch doctor, the wise person. You read any of those old stories, you look at the heroes of Greek myth, and these are people who are doing things that are outside the social norm, who are breaking social barriers, who are forcing interactions that aren't typical for the cultures that they're in. These are the people who are praised and are held up as an example of what we ought to try and strive for. And now we want people to sit down at a desk and do the same thing for 8 hours a day for an hourly wage.
Yeah, and ultimately, that's really where most progress comes from, right? Is somebody being able to think outside of the box of that whatever it is has been constrained in for so long before you can make that sort of leap forward. So that's an interesting way of looking at it. All right, that was Jim. Thanks so much again to him for coming on the show. A quick reminder, if you're listening and you have any feedback, thoughts, questions, etc., please don't hesitate to get in touch with me, either via the website, anxiouschildpodcast.com, or on Instagram at the Anxious Child Podcast. So that's it for today. Until next time, be well and be in touch.
This podcast is not intended as medical or psychological treatment. In no way should it replace treatment from a mental health professional.